Hi, this is Indigenous Voices on Voting with Moms Clean Air Force. My name is Shayna Oliver. I am a field organizer with Moms Clean Air Force Colorado. I advocate for Indigenous people's rights, our rights to clean air, water, and lands, as well as fighting for the next 7 generations. I would like to introduce you to all our speakers. We have speakers all the way from Iowa, here from Colorado, as well as New Mexico, and all the way to Alaska. And I want you to enjoy the discussion we have with these Indigenous voices and very powerful discussion we have. So please enjoy our Indigenous voices on voting with Moms Clean Air Force.
My Tlingit name is Ashita. I am of the Kiksadi clan, which our emblem is the frog. And I am grandchild of the Kagwantan Wolf clan. And we Kiksadi women are known as the herring ladies. And I am from what is now known as Sitka, Alaska. And I currently am not working, but I guess people, I'm an activist. I've been working on assuring that our foods, I think it's one of our most important foods, herring eggs continue to be available for my grandchildren. I have 2 children, and I was just trying to count. I think, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. And I am delighted, grateful to be here and to talk about this really, really important topic. Good cheese, thank you.
Ashita Nadishis Nagan Mamisun, Manimashkwaki. My name is Ashita, that is my traditional name, and my government name is Stephanie Bad Soldier Snow. I am from the Meskwaki community in central Iowa, and I am an anthropologist with a focus in Native American studies, cultural consultant, published poet, public speaker, performer, and I guess most importantly, I'm a mom of 2. And I'm very honored to be with all of you today.
Hello, I'm Renee Chacon. I'm Youth Program Coordinator at Spirit of the Sun and co-founder from Women from the Mountain. I am also Dene Mexica. I am Indigenous Chicana to Southern Colorado and New Mexico's regions. So we're the Pueblo Chicanos, I always say. We're in that space. And I'm very grateful to be a part of this conversation, to represent from that narrative, especially, and most importantly, as a mama with 2 sons, for our future generations, and the importance of really holding our stewardship and responsibility in a good way, in a sacred way. So thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful for you women. Thank you, Shayna, for organizing too.
Okay, my name is James Skeet of the Red Sheet clan and born of Leaning Tower. Other than that, I'm excited to be with you all and look forward to our discussion.
What makes it so important in voting for you as an Indigenous community leader?
Historical trauma for probably the last couple of decades, if not longer. And Alaska is quite a bit different than what we call the South 48. We don't have reservations, but we have federally recognized tribes. I think it was in 1912, somewhere in the early teens, that the territory of Alaska decided that we, Indigenous people, could become citizens under certain conditions. So since we weren't citizens, we couldn't vote. And the state legislature passed a law, and I might get the numbers wrong, but still you can see it was really difficult because in order to become a citizen, you had to get affidavits from all of the teachers at the Indian school saying that you were civilized. Then you had to get another 5 white citizens to go to court and testify that you were civilized. And being civilized meant that you weren't practicing your culture, you weren't speaking your language, and that you were assimilating. And as I was researching this, I actually found a citizenship paper of a relative from 1915 and really just tried to put myself in his shoes of how painful that must have been for him to have to do that. And then, and also in 1912, basically, the Alaska Native Brotherhood was formed here in Ashita and Sitka. And they were specifically formed to fight for citizenship rights, to fight for the rights of unions and labor. And my great-grandfather, who was actually from Canada, was the only non-Tlingit co-founder out of 13 people. And then we were given citizenship in 1924. But of course, like so many other places, have had many, voter suppression, basically. And so if I say that I want to honor my ancestors, then it's definitely my responsibility to stand up and vote. And I know that they were fighting for me to be able to do this. And the fight that they had was not easy. It wasn't easy. They, also, the land claims, like so many other places, the federal government came in and took our lands with basically no compensation. And I've heard stories, even during the Depression, they kept fighting for us. I heard stories of them auctioning off buckets of water for the fight during the Depression. And so it's like, I won't dishonor them. I will not dishonor them by not voting. And I think that one of the things that, I've really been trying to do, since I know the younger generation is more social media, right? So my family is pretty large and almost all of them are here. And we probably have maybe 50 people on our Facebook page. And so I have started telling stories on Facebook of saying, this is why you need to vote. And this is who your parents are. This is who your grandparents are. And to really trying to find different ways to reach out to them, to let them know the importance. And then locally here, we've had some really good successes. We had Sitka, we're maybe 15 to 18% of the overall population of the city and borough of Sitka, and we have a city assembly. And about 3 years ago, we started a decolonization group here. And so it's made up of us and our allies, and some people, and we got together and figured out, okay, the election is coming up. And we had, one of our Native women stepped up to run, and she overwhelmingly won a seat. She got the most votes of anybody, and she's the first Native woman to be on the assembly. Yes, absolutely. Snaps for her for stepping up and doing it. And, and that's organizing. And it is really easy to sit back and go, oh my God, look at everything we've lost. But you know what? Look at everything we have. And look at all of the strong ancestors that we have behind us. And let's carry on for them, and in their names and in their spirit. So those are a few reasons. Sheesh, thank you.
Well, I have to kind of back up to my younger years as a teen, getting ready to hit that age to be able to vote. To be honest with you, And I think I'm gonna assume that most of us have this sort of experience, but I was really pessimistic. I always felt like, does it really matter? Does my vote really matter that much? It was kind of the same attitude I had when I went to college, and there was racism happening around me every day. I was the only Native person on campus. And so I was faced with that all the time. And also with this idea of, well, they really don't want me to graduate. They really don't care if I graduate or not, right? And so I had that attitude about voting as well, which was, I guess, pretty negative, but it's exactly what we were kind of talking about before we started recording today, which was, this that feeling of you just kind of don't matter. You already have this trauma that you carry around. You know how you've been treated around your community, in your community, and so you really feel like your voice doesn't matter. And as the First People, we're really rarely acknowledged, and part of that is because of our population size in this country, right? We make up such a small percentage of the total population. So it's hard to have that hope to say, my vote's going to count. And especially when all of us as tribal groups can't quite get together and agree on one thing, right? So, but I think the more that I got involved in different things with tribal operations, economic development, working with the Historical Preservation Department, language revitalization, and then our food sovereignty initiative, and then going on into things like hemp production and those kind of things, then you start to realize just how important it is to be involved politically, and it's almost like you get pulled into it regardless. So because all of those things, for us as sovereign people, we have to understand that whole process. We have to understand how all of that then affects us. Not only our individual communities or us as individuals, individual people, but whatever sort of whatever the federal government decides, whatever our laws say, that's going to affect all of us. And so that's where it becomes really important for us to vote on what is happening, so not just general elections, right? But then you have other things on a more local level. So that's really how I started to realize it's really important to understand this whole system, to understand kind of the workings of things around us and not just within our own communities. And so that's when I started to vote.
Honestly, and thank you women too before, and those that came before. Honestly, it's the last little bit of our collective power here in Colorado. We're being choked out right now with a lot of wildfires, EPA regulations, lack of affordable housing, a number of dynamic issues that if you don't understand where you are in your space and time, and even if you do have connections with your cultural identity, understand where it involves in the modern identity and where you have that last bit of, like I said, collective power as a community to use it in representation. That's why it's important. And that's a lot. I understand that that's a lot and that it comes from a lot of different spaces. But it really means just understanding your local issues, understanding what you're voting on and how that's going to influence your representation in your, again, your space and time and your resistance for existing if you're Indigenous in your space. So what I mean by that is get to know your city councils, get to know what you're voting on in your city councils, how it involves your property taxes, how it involves your influence in your education systems and your healthcare. We do need to all be more active. And I'm grateful for those that have been before that have taken on all that activity, but to truly honor them, I feel that all of us need to respect that by all of us taking up more of that activity on ourselves too, and more of that responsibility on ourselves too. And voting in and of itself is designed that way, whether we like it or not in this institution. And we do need to recognize that this institution already limits us so much from being targeted from so many different ways, especially Indigenous communities. And I deal in Denver, where you have 2 reservations still here of the Southern Ute and Mountain Ute reservations here in Colorado, but 48 tribes that travel through. So we have, I think only 70,000 tribal affiliated and that are enrolled that we know of in the city. But we have thousands that live in and around Denver that we don't truly know in our populations, but all of us are fragmented and redlined. So the way that we can understand our importance of voting is all of us collectively knowing that we can represent in our spaces by knowing how we can influence them. And I don't want to say that voting is sacred though. So I don't want to go that far in my opinion, because if this institution held it as sacred, then yes, it would be sacred because it was mimicked after Native ideology of governance, but it wasn't held to that as a sacred way. So it's not sacred, but it's the last little bit of voting in that democratic way of our ancestors, even held within this democracy, and kind of it was hidden whether we realize it or not, that we can utilize. And that's highly important to still have of our representation. That is still in American identity. So I find that really important. I try to teach that to my kids and the kids that I come in contact with a lot. So that's why.
And it's really an honor and a privilege to be here with you. And I just love what you all are doing in terms of Mom's Clean Air Force. I think that's really at a young age, doing the things that you're doing is incredible. The one thing that I'm a farmer on the western side of New Mexico. We talk about climate change and all this stuff. We are living the climate change. We have a small demonstration farm, and on that demonstration farm, we grow just about everything. But the basis of our growing is really based on the condition of the soil and how we can amend it. Recently, they've thrown around this sexy word called regenerative. Everybody seems to be migrating to that, but you have to realize that our Indigenous people were doing this way, way beyond, our concept of history. They've been doing it for eons. And so something is happening, which is a pivotal moment in this country, not just in governance and laws and how we treat the land and what we're looking at in terms of air quality, land, and the condition of our land, the desertification that's happening. All of this, we're now, since contact with the colonists, with Native Americans, Indigenous people, we're at the 7th generation. And it's interesting that Shana mentioned that, the 7th generation. And the 7th generation is really about how are you doing things today that will affect 7th generation down the road. And that's a real big responsibility. But let me just get back and explain a little bit of some things that will help probably lay the foundation of why I vote and why I decide to participate with voting and governance and how we need to engage ourselves. The one thing that you have to understand is because of the way Indigenous people have been treated, we oftentimes want to escape from that oppressive government. So one way that we do that is aggressively through fighting or through wars or through retaliation or violence. But then there's another side. It's a passive way of just dealing with things and not really participating in the process that we are under now, that we're deferring under a different government. But if you really study the government as it is in terms of democracy and a republic, it started with Indigenous people. The Six Nation, the Eastern Iroquois Nation, established a lot of the sort of the blueprint for the ideas of a republic and a democracy. What's happening now is the pendulum has swung towards more of a democracy where everybody seems to be fighting for their rights. And if you go too far in that way, a lot of times what you have is just everybody elbowing each other for their rights. But what you need to understand in terms of a republic is we need good leaders, leaders that are accountable. The buck stops with them. They take responsibility. So in that concept of the Six Nation establishing the Confederacy, that's why we call him Commander in Chief, the president. It's because that came from some of the ideas of indigenous people, the Iroquois Nation. When taxation without representation with the Tea Party, that's when Americans, so to speak, started drinking coffee was during the boycott of the Boston Tea Party. The colonists dressed up like natives, and the natives that they dressed up as was Mohawks, and that was the executive branch of that confederacy. So all these concepts and ideas about a republic came from indigenous people. The people, the wampum belt, that they would bring out and talk about that. It's the same way with southern tribes, tribes in the West. All of them have ways of governing themselves. It was not necessarily a democracy. It was a deeper democracy. It was more, you had to convince somebody that didn't quite agree with you to agree with you. So everybody has a consensus with each other, and then they made a decision. So what happened with the Navajo Nation was we had a government that was transferred on us for the extraction of minerals and resources from our reservation. And that government is still there. So it's a very extractive government. And we're supposed to vote for people that extract resources, minerals, and things from our reservation. That's happened over and over and over again. So it's really hard for individuals, indigenous individuals, to want to vote because all this stuff is happening in front of them. But let me tell you, your vote is very, very important because you're participating. You're not just a passive recipient, but you're participating and making changes. Right now, it's so critical to vote because there's a lot of things on the ballot that were never before, really on a broad scale, wasn't on the ballot before. One is the systemic racism that we're seeing. And that all began from the industrial mechanical systems that marginalized, that made units, that forced people to become mechanical. And so we now are living in a generation where a lot of this stuff is starting to fall apart. The currency-based economy, all these economies. In a lot of indigenous communities, we are in a dependency economy. We need our resources from the outside. So having this farm, one of the things we're doing is trying to be self-sufficient and own our own direct marketing. And Shayna, if you want to change policies, one of the best ways to do that is to put market pressure on them. And because most policies are black and white. So policies that need to be changed has to happen within that community conscious of each other and relating to one another and really working together in this kind of sense of love. Let me explain that. When we were doing a lot of research in anthropology, we were studying a lot of cultures that way back in the day, we were finding a lot of what do you call it, artifacts of elders and crippled people being buried in this burial site. And so we started discussing a lot of that information because my background is in anthropology. So when we started doing that, we realized that this group of tribe or people really cared for one another. So in their caring, they were burying a lot of these seniors that could have been not about the production of that tribe that could easily be removed. They were taking care of them to their very end. And then they had crippled people, a lot of crippled people in indigenous concepts and through indigenous lens. Those crippled people carry a lot of spiritual sort of mechanism within them. So they were very special people. So never really people weren't marginalized in indigenous communities. So some of those things, those concepts of a community caring for one another through loving one another, it creates a really strong tribe. So in a way, in this America, we have become very much polarized. We've also become, and I think that's related to how we grow our crops. You know, we monocrop one plant species and that's it. We don't polycrop, which is nature's way. Nature's pattern is really diversity and variety. So it really starts from the ground. You know, what is the ground doing? And the destruction of the ground is really at stake right now. How you vote and who you vote in is going to determine how the soil is treated, how the atmosphere is treated, how we treat one another. So I think for Indigenous people, now is the time to have our voices to be reckoned with. It's rolling back over to where now we're beginning, people are seeking Indigenous voices because we know how to take care of the environment. We know how to take care of each other. We always have. I mean, we know how to barter with one another when there's no currency-based economy. So I think it's really important to participate and allow your voice to be heard within this government. And it's not a government that was brought in from Europe. It's always been a government that's indigenous to this, and that's not even recognized. That legacy of the Iroquois Nation, the Six Nation, the Cayugas, the Mohawks, the Onondaga, the Seneca, all those are wonderful tribes that created the platform. That's why Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin used to say, why can't we govern ourselves, us despotist colonists, like the noble savage? And if you look at the early pictures of Indigenous people, they were treated like Greek gods. They were drawn like Greek gods. And all that information has been hidden from our America. Even the word America, that word means Indian. Those British people you would point, not about American Vespucci, but the Brits would slang use to call us Indians over across the shores. And these are white people, colonists, the Europeans that came in, immigrants that came in. The slang word that they used was American. That was the slang word for Indians. So most people don't realize that they are Native Americans. And it's the chance for Indigenous people on these lands to become indigenous. When they start burying their grandfathers and their grandmothers, then they'll own up to taking responsibility for the air, for the land, for the atmosphere, for the environment. We have to all come together and do some polycultural. And that's why it makes our farm really strong, is because we have diversity. Some people call it permaculture, but that's all native people, how they grew things. You know, it's a mixture of things. They always looked out for that diversity. That's why the immigration is not about immigration. It's about migration. We've been migrating up and down Mexico, all the way up to the Bering Straits, back and forth. Commerce has been happening. It hasn't been a frontier or wilderness. You know, this has been our lands. All these mountains were named, and then somebody comes in and names them, like Mount Washington or something like that, when they've already had indigenous names. So a lot of things are beginning to flip on itself. And I think, Shana, you're right, the seventh generation, something's going on that we really need to participate. Your indigenous voices are more important than ever before, because when you vote, you're saying that I'm participating in this governance, and I have a voice, that I'm not just going to be done to, you know, that we are participating in the process and we are becoming self-sufficient again in our vote.
Now, what would you have to say to Native eligible voters, and why it's important to be engaged in local governments?
You know, we've had some really, I think, great successes here lately. And, you know, I told you about the decolonization group as well. We were also recognized by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for Healthy Communities. We were the only community that listed undoing racism as one of the ways that we were looking towards being healthier. And so there have been different groups working on basically, you know, like undoing racism in different ways. And one of the things that happened is that, well, there's a couple things. So the city of Sitka had as their logo cannons. And the cannons represented the Russians who were here before the United States. And the Russian history was always emphasized. And that was painful for a number of us. And so it came up to vote. And fortunately, I think that we've been vocal enough that it passed. So now the logo has changed. And to include kutia, or a totem pole. So there's native representation rather than the Russian representation. And then there was also a statue of a colonizer, Baranov, who was Russian, who came here specifically to basically almost hunted the sea otter to extinction here in a few short years. And there was a statue right outside the place where they hold the assembly meetings. And so that also came up to a vote to move him, to move the statue. And it was really powerful. We held a couple of rallies, and it was all by pretty much word of mouth. And the second one was a completely silent rally before an assembly meeting. And I would say 150 people showed up outside, and we all social distanced and wore our masks, and it passed to move him. Yeah, so I think, you know, not everybody has to protest, but I think those were extremely powerful for the general population of Sitka, and maybe those people who are hesitant to stand up, because, you know, it can be dangerous. It can feel like a dangerous thing to do. But again, I just think that, you know, people do feel like maybe their vote doesn't make a difference, but we certainly can, you know, make a difference. And I think, you know, the last election and here in Sitka, we have a government to government relationship with the city. You know, our tribal council goes into the city assembly meetings, and there's a representative to talk about, you know, maybe some of the things that the city is considering that will affect tribal citizens, and vice versa. Now the mayor of Sitka is the representative to the tribal council, so he will be going to the meetings to let the tribe know anything and consult with the tribal government. And that's huge. I think we're probably the only ones in the state of Alaska that have that right now. So, you know, I think here it's, you know, if we can do this here, I think it can happen other places, and we can affect change. And, you know, with voting, you don't have to let everybody know who you're voting for. You can go and you can make your voice heard, and you can feel comfortable in, you know, in saying that, yes, this is something that I can do that, you know, I don't have to ask anybody else about, and this is the way I get my voice heard. I think as challenging as the times have been, it's a really exciting time, because I think more and more people are getting involved. It's a great time to get involved. And I hope that, you know, I'm definitely going to try to use social media. I'm trying to figure out TikTok, if you know anybody that can help me with that. And, you know, Instagram and Facebook and all of those things to get people interested. So, yeah, we can make a difference for sure. Thank you.
I think one advantage that we have here in our area is that most people are pretty engaged, and particularly in their tribal elections. So it's kind of built in. I guess I would say that they're pretty active that way generally when it comes to tribal issues, and then of course those then kind of ripple out to the surrounding community, which is a county that is just, I don't know, 2 to 4 miles away, the next community over. And so, and of course we've already mentioned this, but that the dilemma that we natives face generally is just whether or not to participate at all. And that because that is a process that has actively worked to quiet our voices. And so again, it's kind of like there's some of that pessimism that happens, and just kind of the I think some sadness revolving around that. And I think for us around here, I was kind of thinking about the negatives and the positives, just at least to have one example of each of those things when we've been involved in local government and decision making and things like that. And one thing that came up a couple of years ago was the tribe was attempting to purchase more acreage because families need more housing, and our tribe also needs some new office space. Our buildings are pretty old, and so they were at a point where they could do that, but the surrounding community blocked that from happening. And so that's one of the examples that where something didn't quite go as planned, and so then we have to sort of rework what we do, change our plans a little bit. And then the positive though is, I think it was about a year ago that our county that we're situated in is Tama County, and they through the efforts of our tribal community close by and sort of following suit of some other counties nearby, they declared Indigenous Peoples Day rather than Columbus Day. And so many years, coming, but finally did that. And so that became a really huge celebration for us. And those are just two small examples, but that's those are the ways that we can have some influence, or at least get our voices heard. And right now, we don't have anyone on the local level from our community. We, like I said, we are pretty active tribally, and so they're usually kind of campaigning right within the community. But we do have someone up for Iowa House, and so that's a first for our state for sure. Again, that's kind of another example of what can be done to get our voices out there. And so it's a woman, yay. And so that's a big deal, and it's pretty impressive.
That's so hard during a pandemic when people are just trying to live, especially for Indigenous communities. I want to tell them where housing stipends are. I want to tell them where, like, that's actually what I want to help with. But if I had to tell the truth, that's where everybody needs to realize. Here in Colorado, the Indigenous communities have been heavily flushed out and choked out of predominantly Denver. I could literally show you all the statistical information about how affordable housing the last 5 years has dwindled for specifically Indigenous communities. And here in Colorado, no Indigenous person should be houseless or have lack of affordable housing. No Indigenous person on this continent should be houseless and have any lack of affordable housing, straight. So that being said, if you're capable, have the ability and the privilege, and knowing that within the perspective right now, it's highly important to know your city council spaces and to sit on those, even if you're youth. I've been advocating also for youth. You might not be able to vote yet, but you can annoy them on those 2-3 minute testimonials, and that's another way to protest. So no, and you get enlightened too, because then you know what's going on in your local counties. And I don't mean like for here the prairie dogs. I mean like legitimately knowing your property taxes and how they're going to influence you. One example is right now that Colorado is supposed to maintain the 45-55 percentage for residential and non-residential taxes. We're about to vote on that, about how that's going to influence that, or whether your taxes are going to be raised. That's going to hit low income and Indigenous BIPOC communities right away if it's within more that they can afford in their property taxes. Knowing those type of things in your spaces is what's going to keep you here on your land. And we need to know that that is part of our identity here in Colorado. So I ask that people become educated on those. And then it does go into learning your elements, knowing where there's certain pollution plumes. Right now we're being influenced by wildfires, but yet we also still have a lot of extractive industries having pollution plumes, fracking spills, just a number of things going on within this space during a pandemic. Being able to voice that on city councils, being able to put your own personal testimonials are impactful and public record. It also shows that you're able to have showed in that space. You need that representation, and representation here in Colorado, and I'm sure in any other spaces directly for Indigenous communities, still matters, because that affects local organizations, whether we can help, even in nonprofits, because I'm also AmeriCorps Vista, that's our federal grant sometimes. And we have to show, unfortunately, through data, show urgency and crucial nature of responding to our communities. And that's how these institutions work. So we still have to work within these institutions, and knowing where you can work within those institutions with some fluidity and real decisiveness on your intention and your agenda to represent your community in the biggest or smallest of ways, whether just putting your personal voice on a city council or going the extra mile to go find out where your next protest is for very legitimate environmental concerns and social concerns. I highly suggest you do that, no matter your age. And if you need those resources, there's a lot of local nonprofits here that have more than enough that would love for you to come in and see. And you know what, some can even possibly pay you a little bit. But yes, in those spaces, if you have the privilege, if you don't, please try to find those spaces that are there to support you. You deserve and have that right. And that's another form of Indigenous representation that we need to maintain. So thank you.
I think that's where the tire meets the road. That local governance is something that is so, so important. I work in the Office of Management and Budget with the Navajo Nation for a bit. And I understand a little bit of what those codes meant and how we amended legislation within the council chambers, and wrote a lot of pieces on not just amendments, but coming up with legislations. So when we did that, we really had a strong feel that this sovereignty that we talk about, we kind of throw it around. It's also a sexy word, you know, sovereignty. But it really means is that you're owning up to how your local government rules itself. And for the last couple of years, we've had like I mentioned, transferred government. What we need is the transforming government, and your participation, your voice can do that, because it might just seem just local, like the chapter houses here that are supposed to be local governance, who our council delegates are, who has our voice in the chambers. It's similar to what the United States government with its House and Senate and presidency is set up. But one thing that we have working against us in the Navajo Nation is we don't have a constitution. And that's one of the things when I was in that role, was I really tried to push the idea of having some kind of constitution for the checks and balance. There is somewhat, but a lot of those codes are hidden. They're in what they call the blue books, and then they run by that. And it's really a weird kind of setup. They call it appropriations, appropriated monies that get appropriated from the federal government. It's just enough to survive, not enough to succeed. So many of our tribal governance have become very bureaucratic in their uptake on that. You know, they picked up on that. And so a lot of them are just kind of taking up space. But once in a great while, you'll run into somebody that really is a leader and is really there for the right reason, the right heart. And those are the people that we need to vote in, that can speak for our people, like Barboncito, Manuelito, a lot of the people that allowed the treaty to take place with the Navajo Nation. And they were spiritual people. They had intact within them their sense of spiritual, bearings. They had a spiritual compass that guided them. So I really think that it is important to vote locally, and make sure that you grill those people too, because a lot of those people are in it for the wrong reasons. But there's some that are really good leaders that if we vote in, can create this transformative government locally, and your participation in that is really, really important.
Thank you. That was very powerful. I think that's very, very powerful and helpful, and an insight of our history and voting for Native.
So yeah, but after 96 years of U.S. citizenship and basically 40 years for all states to really allow Natives to vote, we need to vote because we need candidates who are who have the integrity to uphold the Constitution. And so the way we get to have a more unified voice, and from that we come from a we culture and not a me culture. That's the way to do that. And so everybody get out and vote and make your voice be heard.
Please get out and vote. Make sure your voice is heard. Gonoschish. Our voices are strong. This is our land. Let them hear us.
Salir a votar, get out the vote, si se puede. Like there's so many different identities I'm very blessed to be a part of. So get out and vote every direction. We're grateful for every one of you. Your existence really is resistance.
Please vote and participate this year. I know there's a lot of, I mean, it's hard sometimes to vote because you feel so disenfranchised, and you know, it's you know, who's corrupt and who isn't, you know. All those things are things that come to mind, but I think there are some really good leaders there.
Well, you heard it from the moms and caregivers. Get out the vote. Vote. Vote this year. Our next 7 generation is counting on us, all of us, to make sure that our voices are heard for not only our ancestors, but for our next 7 generations. So thank you all for joining us, and get out the vote.